Have you always been friends? What's up with you and Eddie?
We never had a fight, ever. I just have always hated their band.
Seattle did not announce itself as a center of gravity. It accumulated weight quietly. Rain soaked the sidewalks, low buildings absorbed sound, and the distance from the American cultural capitals produced a condition that felt less like isolation and more like insulation. The city functioned as a margin, and margins have a way of producing their own internal pressure. By the late 1980s, that pressure was no longer invisible. It was audible in rehearsal rooms, in independent radio, in the stubborn refusal of bands to sound polished or reassuring. Something was forming without a name, without a plan, without a shared manifesto. It was a mood before it was a movement. The United States at that moment was reorganizing its myths. The promises of the previous decade had thinned. Prosperity existed, but it felt uneven, conditional, distant. Cultural confidence was high on the surface, yet fragile underneath. Music reflected that contradiction. Stadium rock still projected certainty and scale, but its language was increasingly decorative. Beneath it, a quieter transformation was underway. Young audiences were drifting towards sounds that acknowledged doubt, fatigue, and a sense of being excluded from the grand narrative. This was not rebellion as spectacle. It was refusal as atmosphere. In that environment, the word grunge would later be imposed, but at the time there was only proximity. Bands shared spaces, equipment, friends, and labels. They circulated within the same geography, without necessarily sharing the same intentions. The scene did not function as a unified front. It functioned as an ecosystem. Differences were tolerated because they were not yet framed as oppositions. No one was asking which band spoke for the city, or which sound defined the generation. Those questions belonged to a later stage, when visibility would sharpen everything. What the city produced first were not stars, but vectors. Lines of force pointing outward. Some bands leaned toward abrasion and collapse, others toward structure and endurance. Some treated music as a form of rupture, others as a space for cohesion. These differences did not initially collide. They coexisted because there was no central stage large enough to force comparison. Seattle was still peripheral enough to allow multiplicity without hierarchy. Then the spotlight arrived. It did not arrive gently. It arrived through radio rotation, magazine covers, and an industry suddenly aware that something commercially viable had emerged from a place it had long ignored. When attention shifted, the ecosystem changed. What had been a network became an arena. Once the arena exists, positions are assigned whether the participants want them or not. Visibility does not merely illuminate. It compresses. It forces bodies and symbols into relation. Within that compression, two forces began to take shape. Not as enemies, not as rivals in the traditional sense, but as contrasting responses to the same historical pressure. One response moved toward disintegration, resisting polish, resisting coherence, resisting the expectation that success should feel stable or redemptive. The other response moved toward solidity, toward endurance, toward the idea that scale could be inhabited without surrendering seriousness. These were not moral positions. They were orientations. Nirvana emerged carrying an energy that felt volatile even to those closest to it. Their presence suggested that success itself was a kind of contamination, something to be confronted rather than embraced. Their music did not promise growth or resolution. It insisted on friction. It made discomfort audible and refused to translate it into aspiration. This stance resonated powerfully because it mirrored an internal conflict already present in the audience. The fear that being seen meant being absorbed. The suspicion that recognition required compromise. Pearl Jam emerged from overlapping roots, but carried a different gravitational pull. Their sound was expansive, grounded, built for projection. Where others collapsed inward, they extended outward. Their songs held space rather than rupturing it. They did not deny intensity, but they organized it. This was not accommodation. It was an attempt to inhabit scale without irony, to stand in the open without pretending the exposure was painless. At first, these orientations did not oppose each other. They existed as parallel answers to the same question. How does one survive visibility without losing meaning? How does a subcultural language behave when it becomes legible to the mainstream? The tension between them was latent, not declared. It lived in interviews, in tone, in what was emphasized and what was dismissed. It was perceptible only because the media began to arrange them side by side. Comparison is not neutral. Once journalists, executives, and audiences began framing one band against the other, the space between them narrowed. Their differences became exaggerated because they were now tasked with representing alternatives. Each was asked, implicitly, to stand for something larger than itself. One for authenticity under threat, the other for endurance under scrutiny. Neither role was chosen. Both were assigned. This is how rivalries are born in modern culture. Not from direct confrontation, but from forced mirroring. When two figures are placed within the same frame, they begin to function as reflections, regardless of their intentions. Each becomes a surface onto which anxieties are projected. The audience no longer listens only to the music. It listens for confirmation of its own internal conflicts. Seattle became a symbolic city rather than a physical one. It transformed into a backdrop onto which national tensions were staged. The local scene was no longer just local. It became an emblem of generational unease. The question was no longer what these bands were doing. It was what they meant. As attention intensified, the atmosphere shifted. What had been shared terrain began to feel like contested space. Not because resources were scarce, but because meaning was. There could only be so many narratives at the center. The industry prefers clarity. It prefers stories that resolve into binaries. This band versus that band. This truth versus that compromise. Complexity is tolerated only briefly, before it is reorganized into spectacle. The rivalry between Nirvana and Pearl Jam did not begin as hostility. It began as compression, as the pressure of being seen too clearly, too suddenly, within a system that demands legibility. It emerged from the collision between internal values and external expectations, from the way media amplifies difference until it feels absolute, from the way audiences seek representatives to carry contradictions they cannot articulate themselves. By the time the conflict became visible, it already had momentum. The arena had been built. The lights were fixed. The crowd was waiting, not for reconciliation, but for contrast. What followed would not simply define two bands. It would shape how an entire era understood authenticity, success, and resistance. The opening act was over. The forces were in position. The friction was about to become explicit. The conditions that produced Nirvana and Pearl Jam were similar on the surface but divergent beneath it. Both emerged from the Pacific Northwest. Both passed through the same clubs, labels, and social circuits, and both absorbed the residue of punk's refusal and hard rock's physicality. Yet similarity of environment does not produce similarity of psyche. Shared geography only sharpens contrast when internal structures differ. What separated these bands was not style alone, but orientation towards self, audience, and power. Nirvana's formation carried the mark of displacement. The band did not originate from the center of Seattle's social gravity, but from its periphery, both geographically and psychologically. This distance mattered. It produced a stance of suspicion towards scenes, hierarchies, and any structure that claimed legitimacy. The band's internal energy leaned toward negation, not as posture, but as reflex. Their work articulated an unresolved tension between exposure and withdrawal. Recognition was not experienced as affirmation, but as intrusion. This orientation shaped not only the sound, but the way success itself was metabolized. At the center of Nirvana's symbolic force was a figure who resisted integration. Fame did not consolidate identity. It fractured it. Public attention intensified internal contradictions rather than resolving them. The persona presented to the world remained unstable, oscillating between provocation and retreat. This instability was not accidental. It functioned as a refusal to stabilize meaning. The band's music became a site where dissonance was preserved rather than resolved. This refusal would later be interpreted as authenticity, but at the time it was closer to vulnerability without insulation. Pearl Jam's formation followed a different trajectory. Its members carried longer institutional memory. They had already navigated prior bands, failed projects, and partial successes. This history produced a thicker psychic skin. Where Nirvana reacted against structures, Pearl Jam attempted to negotiate with them. Their orientation toward the industry was not naive, but neither was it purely antagonistic. They approached scale as a problem to be managed rather than a threat to be annihilated. This difference would later be moralized by observers, but initially it was pragmatic. Psychologically, Pearl Jam operated with a stronger sense of continuity. Identity was not experienced as something constantly under siege. The band's public presence aimed for coherence, even when addressing discomfort or anger. Their songs did not dissolve into noise or irony. They sought articulation. This does not imply emotional safety. It implies containment. Where Nirvana allowed cracks to remain open, Pearl Jam reinforced the structure around them. Both responses addressed the same cultural anxiety, but through opposing strategies. These differing orientations towards self and structure became significant once visibility increased. Before that moment, they were simply personal tendencies. Afterward, they became symbolic positions. The media did not invent this difference, but it amplified it, aligning each band with a narrative role that exceeded their intentions. One was framed as the voice of negation, the other as the voice of endurance. One as refusal incarnate, the other as compromise redeemed. These framings simplified complex realities, but they stuck because they resonated with broader cultural tensions. The early 1990s marked a moment when the American ideal of upward mobility felt increasingly hollow. Economic shifts, cultural fatigue, and generational disillusion created a psychological climate primed for projection. Audiences were searching for figures who could embody their ambivalence toward success. Nirvana became associated with the fear that success corrupts. Pearl Jam became associated with the hope that success can be inhabited without surrender. Neither position was absolute, but the contrast was compelling. Within the industry, this contrast was immediately legible. Record labels, radio programmers, and journalists require differentiation to function. They need narratives that can be circulated, repeated, and opposed. The emergence of two commercially viable bands from the same city created an irresistible binary. The question was never which band was better. It was which orientation would define the meaning of alternative culture now that it was no longer alternative. Psychologically, this binary activated mimetic dynamics. Each band became a mirror through which the other was interpreted, whether consciously or not. Success became a zero-sum symbol. Visibility felt competitive even when material resources were abundant. When one band ascended, The other was framed as being displaced, regardless of reality. This framing intensified internal pressures. It was no longer enough to create. Each release, interview, and appearance was read as a response, even when it was not intended as one. This is where rivalry begins to crystallize, not through direct conflict, but through symbolic mediation. Desire becomes triangulated. Recognition is no longer sought directly, but through differentiation from the rival. Even rejection becomes meaningful only when it contrasts with the other's acceptance. In this structure, authenticity itself becomes competitive. Each side is pushed to exaggerate its defining traits in order to remain legible within the binary. For Nirvana, this pressure intensified an existing instability. Resistance hardened. Ambivalence toward the industry sharpened into critique. The band's relationship to media became adversarial, not because media attention was unwanted, but because it felt invasive. The more the band was framed as a generational voice, the more violently that role was resisted. Visibility became a weight rather than a platform. For Pearl Jam, the same pressure produced a different response. Scrutiny prompted an attempt to assert control. The band began to question the mechanisms through which attention was distributed. Their resistance did not take the form of collapse, but of confrontation with institutions. They did not reject the stage. They challenged the conditions under which the stage operated. This approach would later be misunderstood as moral superiority, but it emerged from a need to preserve agency within scale. By the time the rivalry entered public discourse, its foundations were already set. Two distinct psychological strategies were operating under the same cultural spotlight, one oriented toward negation and refusal, the other toward negotiation and endurance. The media did not create these differences, but it sharpened them into symbols. The arena was now active. The friction was no longer latent. It had become a structure through which the culture would interpret itself. The rivalry becomes visible when private tension is translated into public signal. This translation does not require direct confrontation. It requires amplification. In the early 1990s, that amplification arrived through interviews, headlines, and the repetitive framing of cultural narratives that demand contrast. As Nirvana's ascent accelerated, every statement began to carry symbolic weight. Words that might once have passed unnoticed were now refracted through the lens of representation. Speech itself became terrain. Nirvana's relationship with language was already volatile. Interviews functioned less as explanations and more as pressure valves. Statements emerged impulsively, shaped by irritation, fatigue, and a deep suspicion toward institutional mediation. When comments about other bands surfaced, they were not strategic. They were reactive. Yet reaction does not remain personal once it enters circulation. Once repeated, it hardens into position. The media did not require consistency. It required friction. Each remark that questioned sincerity or accused others of opportunism was lifted from its context and presented as declaration. Pearl Jam entered this moment from a different posture. Their public language was more measured, less incendiary. This was not caution alone. It was an expression of internal cohesion. They did not experience the interview space as hostile in the same way. Their responses tended to deflect rather than provoke. Yet deflection itself becomes meaningful when placed against provocation. Silence can be interpreted as restraint, diplomacy, or evasion, depending on the frame imposed around it. The press quickly discovered that these differences could be staged. Articles juxtaposed quotes. Headlines implied opposition where none had been explicitly declared. The city that had once functioned as shared ground was reframed as contested territory. Seattle was no longer a margin producing multiplicity. It became a symbolic capital whose identity required a dominant voice. The question was not who came first, but who spoke most truthfully for the moment. This framing activated mimetic tension. Nirvana's refusal of polish, of accessibility, of narrative clarity was increasingly contrasted with Pearl Jam's willingness to occupy larger stages. The contrast did not reflect intent so much as effect. One band's discomfort with scale appeared as moral resistance. The other's endurance within scale appeared as accommodation. These readings were not neutral. They carried implicit judgments that audiences absorbed and repeated. Psychologically, this period intensified projection. Nirvana became a screen for anxieties about co-optation. Pearl Jam became a screen for anxieties about compromise. Fans aligned themselves not only with music, but with attitudes toward success itself. To choose one band over the other was to articulate a position on visibility, power, and legitimacy. The rivalry thus moved beyond sound and entered identity. Media environments do not merely report conflict. They manufacture continuity by insisting that every event participates in a larger story. Album releases were framed as responses. Chart positions were read as victories or defeats. Even scheduling decisions became symbolic. The industry thrives on momentum, and momentum requires comparison. Each upward movement by one band was interpreted as pressure on the other, regardless of their internal realities. For Nirvana, this environment intensified an already fragile relationship with success. The band's rapid elevation created a dissonance between intention and reception. Songs written from a place of fragmentation were now received as anthems. Irony was flattened into declaration. The gap between meaning and interpretation widened. In that gap, resentment accumulated, not toward audiences alone, but toward the machinery that converted ambiguity into certainty. Pearl Jam experienced a different form of pressure. Their growth was steadier, their audience expansion more gradual. This trajectory created expectations of leadership. They were increasingly positioned as responsible figures within the scene. Responsibility is another form of weight. It demands coherence. It demands response. The band's attempts to maintain autonomy within this framework required negotiation rather than refusal. Their resistance would take institutional form, but at this stage it was still embryonic. As the rivalry narrative solidified, both bands were pulled further into symbolic roles. Nirvana was cast as the volatile center, the force that destabilized norms. Pearl Jam was cast as the stabilizer, the band capable of carrying the scene forward without implosion. These roles simplified reality, but they also structured perception. Once roles exist, deviation becomes visible. Each action is measured against expectation. This first phase of the rivalry did not produce open hostility. It produced alignment. Each band was gradually aligned with a cultural function. The conflict was not yet personal. It was structural. It unfolded through language, framing, and repetition. The arena had not erupted into collision, but the boundaries were now marked. The next movements would intensify this alignment, transforming implication into escalation. Escalation occurs when symbolic positions begin to demand confirmation through action. Once the rivalry had been narratively installed, the environment itself started to behave as if opposition were real and active. Media cycles tightened, questions repeated, comparisons hardened. What had once been incidental differences were now treated as intentional signals. In this phase, the rivalry no longer required provocation. It sustained itself through expectation. Public statements became increasingly difficult to contain. For Nirvana, Interviews intensified into sites of struggle rather than communication. The band's front figure was repeatedly positioned as a spokesperson for a generation, a role that felt both invasive and fraudulent. Each attempt to resist that designation paradoxically reinforced it. When irritation surfaced, it was read as authenticity. When disdain was expressed toward perceived conformity, it was elevated into critique. The boundary between personal frustration and public philosophy collapsed. Comments directed toward Pearl Jam during this period carried disproportionate force. Even when framed as aesthetic disagreement or industry critique, they were interpreted as moral judgment. The suggestion that some forms of success were safer, cleaner, or more palatable became a lightning rod. It resonated because it mirrored an anxiety already circulating within alternative culture. The fear that mass appeal required dilution. That fear did not originate with Nirvana, but Nirvana articulated it with a rawness that made it difficult to ignore. Pearl Jam, for their part, found themselves increasingly cast as a counterexample. Their music, rooted in structure and emotional projection, was now scrutinized for signs of inauthenticity. Their presence on large stages was reframed as ambition. Their refusal to collapse was interpreted by some as a refusal to risk. These readings overlooked the band's internal discipline and ethical concerns, but narratives do not prioritize nuance. They prioritize contrast. The escalation was amplified by the mechanics of exposure. Television networks, magazines, and radio benefited from framing difference as conflict. Award shows and charts provided visible metrics that could be read as victories or defeats. When Pearl Jam's commercial momentum surged, it was interpreted as a symbolic displacement. The idea that two bands could occupy prominence simultaneously was less compelling than the story of replacement. One must fall for the other to rise. This logic intensified competitive perception, even where none was consciously intended. For Nirvana, commercial comparison sharpened existing insecurities. Success was already a source of discomfort. Being surpassed, or even framed as being surpassed, activated a deeper sense of loss of control. Visibility was no longer simply overwhelming. It was unstable. Attention could shift without warning, revealing the fragility of cultural centrality. Pearl Jam experienced escalation differently. Their growing audience increased scrutiny of their choices. Each decision carried the weight of representation. They were no longer simply a band navigating success. They were positioned as custodians of a scene. This expectation provoked a defensive posture, not toward other bands, but toward the industry mechanisms that sought to define them. Their resistance would soon become overt, but at this stage it manifested as tension beneath the surface. Psychologically, the rivalry entered a phase of mirroring. Each band began to function as a reference point against which the other was interpreted. Nirvana's volatility made Pearl Jam appear stable. Pearl Jam's stability made Nirvana appear volatile. These traits existed independently, but their contrast exaggerated them. The audience participated in this exaggeration, selecting sides not merely based on sound, but on identification with a particular strategy for surviving exposure. The escalation was not driven by events alone. It was driven by repetition. Each cycle of comparison reinforced the narrative. Each quote, chart position, or televised appearance accumulated symbolic weight. The rivalry became a structure that organized perception. Even moments of neutrality were absorbed into it. Silence could be read as restraint or concession. Absence could be interpreted as avoidance or defeat. As this phase progressed, the tension moved closer to the personal without fully becoming personal. The bands occupied overlapping spaces, festivals, and media platforms. Proximity increased, but communication did not. The gap between them was filled by interpretation rather than dialogue. This absence of direct engagement allowed the rivalry to remain abstract, which paradoxically made it more powerful. Abstract conflicts are easier to mythologize. By the end of this movement, the rivalry had matured into a cultural mechanism. It no longer required new material to sustain itself. It operated through memory, expectation, and symbolic alignment. The stage was set for a shift from narrative escalation to consequence. What followed would not simply intensify the conflict. It would transform it, embedding it within the broader culture that had helped produce it. The third movement of the rivalry unfolds not through louder confrontation, but through consequence. When symbolic pressure reaches a certain density, it begins to reshape behavior. Actions that might otherwise appear isolated start to read as statements. Decisions acquire narrative gravity. In this phase, the rivalry stops being a story told about the bands and starts influencing the conditions under which they operate. For Nirvana, the accumulation of expectation produced a tightening spiral. The band's attempt to assert autonomy increasingly took the form of negation. Each refusal became more pointed because the surrounding system interpreted refusal itself as content. The effort to escape representation paradoxically intensified representation. The more the band resisted being a generational emblem, the more that resistance was consumed as proof of authenticity. Visibility became inescapable. Even withdrawal functioned as spectacle. This tension manifested most clearly in the band's relationship to its own audience. Songs written as fractures were now sung in unison. Dissonance was absorbed and returned as affirmation. The gap between intention and reception widened further. What had once been a dialogue with discomfort hardened into a monologue imposed by mass recognition. The band was no longer simply heard. It was inhabited by projections that could not be controlled or corrected. Within this environment, the rivalry with Pearl Jam took on an almost gravitational quality. It did not require active hostility to exert force. The presence of an alternative model of success sharpened Nirvana's sense of entrapment. Pearl Jam's ability to stand within scale, to remain legible without disintegration, functioned as an implicit challenge. Not because it contradicted Nirvana's values, but because it demonstrated a possibility that Nirvana could not tolerate for itself. Pearl Jam, meanwhile, entered a phase of deliberate resistance. As their prominence solidified, the band began confronting the structures that mediated their relationship with the public. Their conflict with ticketing systems and media practices was not incidental. It was a response to the same pressure that had destabilized Nirvana, articulated through a different strategy. Rather than collapsing under exposure, Pearl Jam sought to redraw the boundaries of the arena. This shift altered the symbolic balance of the rivalry. Pearl Jam was no longer merely enduring scale. They were challenging the architecture that produced it. This positioned them differently within the cultural imagination. They became figures of confrontation rather than accommodation. Yet this confrontation was procedural, institutional, slow. It lacked the immediacy that media narratives favor. As a result, it was often overshadowed by the more volatile drama surrounding Nirvana. The contrast between these responses deepened the mythic dimension of the rivalry. Nirvana came to embody the cost of exposure without mediation. Pearl Jam came to embody the possibility of endurance through confrontation with systems rather than self. These were not roles chosen consciously, but they hardened as events unfolded. The culture required symbols to process its own contradictions, and both bands were pressed into service. The culmination of this phase arrived not as resolution, but as rupture. The pressures surrounding Nirvana reached a point where continuation itself became impossible. The collapse was not sudden, but it was final. In its aftermath, the rivalry was irrevocably transformed. What had been a dynamic tension between two living forces became a static contrast between presence and absence. The arena did not empty. It froze. Pearl Jam's continued existence after this rupture altered the narrative terrain. Their persistence was no longer measured against a rival operating in parallel. It was measured against a memory. The contrast shifted from competition to comparison across time. Pearl Jam now occupied a space shaped by loss, carrying the weight of being one of the last visible inheritors of a moment that could not be repeated. This transformation did not dissolve the rivalry. It transmuted it. The tension between negation and endurance did not disappear. It became historical rather than immediate. The third movement ends here, not with reconciliation or victory, but with crystallization. The forces that once collided in real time are now fixed in cultural memory, awaiting interpretation rather than response. When rivalry leaves the realm of active exchange and enters collective memory, it begins to operate less as conflict and more as structure. The tension between Nirvana and Pearl Jam exceeded the boundaries of biography and chronology. It reorganized how alternative culture understood itself at the moment it became visible. The rivalry functioned as a cultural sorting mechanism, dividing attitudes, values, and identifications long before it divided fans. At its core, the conflict articulated a split within the idea of authenticity. Nirvana came to symbolize authenticity as refusal, a commitment to fracture, to discomfort, to the exposure of instability without consolation. Pearl Jam came to symbolize authenticity as responsibility, a willingness to carry weight, to endure visibility, and to negotiate power without surrendering moral gravity. These were not opposing moral claims, but incompatible strategies for inhabiting the same cultural terrain. This incompatibility produced polarization. Audiences did not simply prefer one band's sound over the other. They aligned themselves with a worldview. To gravitate toward Nirvana was to affirm suspicion toward systems, toward permanence, toward narratives of growth. To gravitate toward Pearl Jam was to affirm the possibility of remaining intact within those systems, even while resisting their excesses. These alignments were rarely articulated explicitly, but they structured perception and loyalty. The media played a decisive role in solidifying this polarization. Coverage rarely explored complexity. It amplified contrast. By repeatedly framing one band as volatile and the other as stable, it transformed difference into opposition. This opposition did not require exaggeration. It required repetition. Over time, repetition produces inevitability. The rivalry came to feel natural, as if it had always existed, even though it was assembled through framing rather than confrontation. Symbolically, the rivalry mapped onto broader cultural anxieties about power and visibility. The early 1990s marked a moment when underground culture was being absorbed at unprecedented speed. The fear was not simply that authenticity would be diluted, but that it would be redefined by the very systems it opposed. Nirvana's collapse became a cautionary symbol of what happens when refusal encounters total exposure. Pearl Jam's endurance became a counter-symbol of what happens when resistance is redirected toward structure rather than self. These symbols extended beyond music. They influenced how subsequent artists understood the risks of visibility. The idea that success could be spiritually corrosive gained cultural legitimacy through Nirvana's trajectory. At the same time, the idea that institutional confrontation could coexist with mass reach gained legitimacy through Pearl Jam's actions. Together, they formed a template, not a solution, but a dilemma that would recur across genres and generations. The rivalry also reshaped the mythology of Seattle itself. The city ceased to be merely a place where bands emerged. It became an arena of symbolic struggle. Seattle was cast as both origin and battleground, a space where authenticity was tested under pressure. This mythology obscured the city's diversity and complexity, but it endured because it provided a narrative anchor for a generation grappling with disillusionment. Tribalism followed naturally. Fans adopted interpretive frameworks that filtered not only music, but ethics. Interviews were parsed for alignment. Choices were judged for consistency. Even silence became meaningful. The rivalry taught audiences how to read culture adversarially, how to locate virtue in opposition rather than synthesis. This habit would later migrate into other domains, shaping how cultural debates were staged and consumed. Importantly, the conflict did not resolve into victory. There was no winner. What emerged instead was a durable tension that continues to inform how authenticity is discussed. The rivalry became a mythic structure, not because it offered closure, but because it refused it. It presented two incompatible answers to the same historical pressure, and left the culture to oscillate between them. In this way, Nirvana and Pearl Jam did not simply reflect a moment. They organized it. Their rivalry provided language, symbols, and reference points through which a generation processed its unease with power, exposure, and meaning. The impact was not confined to the 1990s. It embedded itself into the grammar of cultural critique, shaping how future conflicts would be understood. By the time the rivalry settled into memory, it no longer belonged to the bands alone. It had become a lens, a way of seeing how culture fractures under attention, and how different strategies of survival produce different kinds of loss. What remained was not hostility, but structure, and structures endure long after their architects are gone. In the aftermath, the rivalry no longer operates as a living tension, but as a fixed geometry within cultural memory. It persists not because it continues to generate new conflict, but because it offers a stable framework for interpreting a specific historical rupture. Nirvana and Pearl Jam become reference points rather than participants. Their opposition hardens into a symbolic axis around which narratives of authenticity, collapse, endurance, and power continue to rotate. Nirvana's absence functions as a permanent interruption. It arrests the story at the moment of maximum intensity and prevents revision. Without continuation, the band's meaning remains suspended in a state of unresolved contradiction. Refusal is preserved without negotiation. Discomfort is preserved without accommodation. The collapse becomes definitive, not as failure, but as endpoint. This finality gives Nirvana a mythic density that resists dilution. There is no later phase to complicate the image, no adjustment to soften the symbol. The figure remains fixed at the edge of visibility, eternally refusing integration. Pearl Jam's legacy unfolds differently because it remains open-ended. Continuation introduces variation. Each album, each tour, each public stance adds sediment rather than closure. Endurance complicates myth. It exposes the costs of persistence and the compromises required to maintain agency over time. Where Nirvana's story is sealed, Pearl Jam's is cumulative. Meaning accrues through duration rather than rupture. This longevity invites reassessment, but it also invites misreading, as persistence is often mistaken for comfort. The rivalry, viewed retrospectively, reveals itself less as a battle between bands and more as a diagram of cultural response. One path leads toward negation, toward an absolute refusal that preserves intensity at the cost of survival. The other leads toward negotiation, toward sustained engagement with systems that threaten to erode meaning. Neither path offers redemption. Each exacts its own price. The rivalry endures because it refuses to resolve this dilemma. Culturally, the myth continues to shape expectations placed on artists who emerge from subcultural spaces into mass visibility. New figures are still measured against these templates. Are they collapsing or enduring? Are they resisting or negotiating? The language may shift, but the structure remains intact. The rivalry has become a tool through which culture disciplines deviation, rewarding legibility and punishing ambiguity depending on the moment. The city of Seattle, too, remains bound to this legacy. It is remembered less for its multiplicity than for its symbolic output. The complexity of the scene is flattened into a narrative of origin and fracture. This simplification persists because it serves memory. It allows a diffuse cultural moment to be recalled through a single tension. The city becomes an emblem rather than a place, a stage rather than a network. What ultimately survives the rivalry is not hostility, but clarity. The clarity that emerges when history hardens into form. Nirvana and Pearl Jam no longer speak to each other. They speak through what they represent. One embodies the cost of exposure without mediation. The other embodies the cost of endurance without disappearance. Their rivalry remains relevant because it articulates a problem that culture has not solved. There is no reconciliation in this legacy and no moral synthesis. The rivalry does not ask to be resolved. It asks to be understood as a permanent feature of cultural life under visibility. As long as power seeks symbols and audiences seek representatives, the tension it mapped will continue to surface. Not as noise, but as structure. Not as conflict, but as inheritance.